Welcome back. In the last video we covered how I insulated the walls of my garden room along with a vapour barrier, and in this video I plasterboard and put up the cement board in the shower room. Plus there's a bonus resource at the end. The first half is theory and the second is action. There's a lot to say, so let's get cracking. Let's first look at a couple of other options for internal finishes, because plasterboard won't suit everyone. For workshops, it's very handy to be able to throw in a screw or nail to hang your tools pretty much anywhere on the walls you like without first having to locate your studs. So OSB or ply is perfect for this, and both can be painted to help hide the fixing screws and to brighten the room. However, as you'll have discovered by this point, neither are cheap, but at least you can opt for the thinner stuff, and it doesn't need to be exterior grade. With ply, you can take it up a notch by creating shadow gaps with a bit of black spray paint, grab adhesive and a few nails. Pine cladding can look great if you're after a summer house, beach hut type look, either painted or with a bit of oil. Or you can get adventurous with reclaimed timber or pallet wood. I wasn't very brave though, so I stuck with plasterboard. It's surprisingly low cost and you can always change the appearance with different coloured paints or wallpaper, or maybe even some peel and stick vinyl for a good feature wall. There are two different ways of finishing plasterboard. You can either go for a full skim, which is common here in the UK, or you can tape and joint, which is essentially plastering between the sheets and leaving the main face of the plasterboard bare. It's conventional wisdom that full skim plastering is a skill that takes a lot of practice, and there's nothing worse than a bad plastering job. I watch a lot of US channels and they make tape and jointing look pretty easy and fun, and having recently shelled out for grounds work, electrics and plumbing, I thought that I'd give it a go rather than hire a plasterer, and after all this is a DIY channel. I'll give you my thoughts on which might be the better choice in the next video, but your decision between the two methods will inform your choice of plasterboard, as square edge plasterboard is typically used for full skim, whereas tapered edge plasterboard is designed for tape and jointing. However, if you're at the plasterboarding stage and haven't yet decided how to plaster, go for a tapered edge because that can be used with either method. So which way should plasterboard be orientated? Hanging it horizontally helps deal with wonky stud work, but hopefully you'll have done a marvellous job, so that shouldn't be such a consideration. However, horizontal hanging provides a greater structural benefit by tying together more of the studs to one sheet. Though as I have OSB on the outside of the walls doing that job, it wasn't a concern. But, and I'm going off on a tangent here, if you want to keep the total project cost down, you can forgo having OSB sheathing and just staple the breathable membrane directly to the outer side of the studs. So in that case, hanging plasterboard horizontally will be very beneficial to increase wall rigidity. Adding more noggins in the wall can help too, of course. Tapered edge plasterboard only has a taper on the two long sides of the plasterboard, not on the shorter sides. So my plan from the outset was to attach the plasterboard vertically on the walls, so the only short non-tapered sides that I would have to tape and joint would be on the ceiling plasterboard, and these are called butt joints. A solid plan, except for one big problem. My studs, and indeed my roof joists, are on 16-inch centres, which is perfect for OSB and ply in 8x4 feet sheets, but as it turns out, plasterboard only comes in 1200mm width, which suits 400mm centres, but not my 16 inches, as it comes up short on the last stud. Now, I'm not a complete idiot. I did look up whether plasterboard came in 8x4 sheets before starting the build, and I found that it did, but when it came to ordering, every company I called said, "Oh yeah, that's a typo." Our strange half-metric, half-imperial system ruining my best laid plans. So how am I going to solve this? I could cut back the plasterboard to the previous stud, but that creates a lot of wasted plasterboard and defeats the purpose of hanging it vertically, as I'd end up with one square edge at each joint. If I turn a 1200 by 2400mm board horizontally, that's better. I still have to cut it back, but there's less waste, and I keep most of the tapered edge, even if I do end up with a few butt joints. However, while the width of plasterboard is fixed at 1200mm, the length you can get it in varies. I asked Gyprock, a plasterboard manufacturer, why these exact lengths exist, and apparently they are for different height ceilings, when hung vertically. However, I also figured something else out. If we bring back the span tables, at the top it shows the conventional spacings, 400, 450 and 600mm, and all of these length plasterboards are divisible by one or more of the different spacings, so that when hung horizontally, the ends of the plasterboard land on the centre of the studs. That's good to know. All with the exception, that is, of 2500mm, but I'm glad it exists because that's how I'm going to solve my problem. I only need to cut 6cm off it to reduce it to 8 feet long, and it was only a little more expensive than the standard 1200 by 2400 sheets. So I feel a bit of a plonker not knowing all this, but you don't know what you don't know, and the learning is in the doing. Plus I promised in part 1 that I'd show all my mistakes, so you'd have to make the same ones. So what's the wider lesson here? Is metric or imperial spacing best for studs and joists? If plasterboard doesn't come in Imperial, maybe we can find OSB in metric. I've scoured about 50 builders merchants online, big and small, and there's no doubt that the Imperial sized boards are far more common. However, Wix, Travis Perkins and Selco, as examples, all stock a 1200 by 2400 9mm board, which would do nicely for the outer walls. For floor and ceiling joists, we need 18mm, and there's scant evidence that this exists in that same sheet size. But it does come in a 590 by 2400mm size that is also tongue and groove. So that fits 400mm or 600mm centres. It's smaller and therefore lighter to get on the roof, and the tongue and groove allows for some expansion while also locking together more tightly so that a rubber roof looks smoother when laid down on top. So if I were to do it all over again, I would, on balance, I think, go for 400mm centres, but it's hardly a clear-cut decision. I'll pin a comment to previous videos as I don't want to mislead anyone, but if you've gone for 16-inch centres like me, don't worry. As you'll see, plasterboard is really easy to cut, and if you have a few wavy joists, it's pretty beneficial to be able to cut it back to the exact size you need rather than coming up short. Phew, that was hard to explain, but hopefully it's clarified the issue a little more and you can make a more informed choice based on what size OSB and ply is available near you. Thickness of plasterboard. It comes in 3 different thicknesses, 9.5, 12.5 and 15mm. 12.5mm is most typically used for 400mm or 16-inch spacings, and the extra rigidity is needed for the ceiling to prevent it from sagging. You could use 9.5mm for the walls, but the price difference is small. 15mm tends to be used if you have wider spacings or if you're trying to increase the fire rating or decrease sound transmittance. I went with 12.5mm all round. Types of plasterboard. In part 15 we discovered there are foil-backed and insulated versions, but there are variations of the actual plasterboard material too. Acoustic plasterboard is designed to deaden sound. It's usually blue in colour and a good choice if you're concerned about noise from a workshop or music studio. Moisture-resistant plasterboard comes in green and is regularly used for bathrooms to prevent mould from growing. Fire-resistant plasterboard comes in an appropriate red colour and is used for where building regs requires increased fire ratings, such as around RSJs. As far as I'm aware, this isn't required for garden room walls on boundaries. I'm still researching this topic, but it seems the focus of non-combustibility is on the outer cladding. And then of course there is the standard ivory coloured plasterboard. All plasterboard has a good degree of fire and moisture resistance and deadened sound as well, so the standard type suited my needs and probably will do for you too. So in summary, my plasterboard is tapered edge, 1200 by 2500mm, 12.5mm thick, and is the standard ivory face stuff. Mine are manufactured by British Gypsum, though Nauf and G-Tech are similarly priced and I'm sure are more or less identical. I bought through a company called CCF who delivered to the driveway. They're heavy, so to lug them into the garden room, I decided to buy a plasterboard carrier rather than the string method that I've used previously for other sheet material, as I thought the string might damage the plasterboard. As a general point, I have always tried to make do with what I have around me, as you'll see in a minute, but as I've progressed through this build, I've slowly come to the conclusion that having the right tool for the job is optimal, if you can afford it of course. Anyway, my friend Steve came over and we set about cutting the plasterboard to length, which is pretty simple. You score the front face of the plasterboard once or twice with a utility knife, and then use a straight edge to snap the plasterboard, before bending it backwards and then using the utility knife again to cut through the paper on the other side. The resulting edge is pretty rough, so you have to use a surf arm which has a blade a bit like a cheese grater, and it just takes a few passes to smooth the edge. So where to start? It seems like best practice is to start with the ceiling plasterboard, the main reason being that the wall plasterboard supports the edges of the ceiling plasterboard. It's particularly important along the side walls if you haven't got anything to screw up into. I positioned a roof joist there for this very purpose, but you can also put a timber or a noggins in at this stage if you like, which I think is better than just supporting the edge with the plasterboard. The other argument is that if there were a fire, flames would be stopped from reaching the roof joist by the ceiling plasterboard, rather than having a direct line upwards were you to do the wall plasterboard first. I should point out that my electrician had all the measurements for the locations of the cables for the downlighters written down, so make sure you have these. If you remember, I situated my roof joist directly above the studs, which at the time meant I didn't have to mark the spacings out, and it's a direct transfer of the weight of the roof through the wall studs. Someone pointed out in the comments that positioning them so wasn't necessary as my double top plate would easily distribute the weight, and that's true, but as you progress through the build, having everything lined up is incredibly helpful. We We started with the back row of plasterboard, and once lifted to the ceiling, you can't see the position of the joist above the back wall, but all I had to do was look down to where my studs were and just screw directly above, as that's where my joists are. The same is true when it comes to the battens on the outside, which you want to be attached to the studs, but the OSB and house wrap block the view of them. As my joists are directly above the studs, I could just make a mark on the breathable membrane directly below the joists, which tell me exactly where my studs are. Anyway, if you want to get the plasterboard up quickly, you might want to just pop a few screws in to hold it, but make sure you at least put them in every joist on the other side of the sheet, so that when you do the next row and cover up the joists, you could just see where the joists are by looking at the screws in the previous row. So how to get heavy plasterboard on the ceiling? Well, your best bet is to hire a panel or sheet lifter. You turn the wheel and it raises it to the ceiling and hey presto. But as I had free labour to make use of, I cheaped out and instead asked Steve to bring his work platform over, and I made a T-bar with some spare timber, a tad longer than the ceiling is high. There are specific plasterboard screws, often Americanized to drywall screws. Opinion differs on the length of screws required, but a good rule of thumb is 3 times the plasterboard thickness, so I use 38mm screws. Spacing of screws is easiest to remember in inches, so for ceiling plasterboard they should be spaced 6 inches on the edge and 8 in the field, and for walls fewer are required, spaced at 8 inches on the edges and 12 in the field. So to get a rough idea of quantities required, for a 2.4 metre squared ceiling sheet, 53 screws are needed, or around 22 per metre squared, and for a wall sheet we need 39 or around 17 per metre squared. For vertically hung wall plasterboard you need a few more at 44 per sheet. So you can work out how many you need, and I'd say add a good 20% on, as much of your plasterboard will be cut down and therefore have more edges. They're pretty useful screws, so they won't go to waste. Screws should be tightened so that they depress the paper on the plasterboard, but not break through it. The depression is particularly important for tape and jointing, as you'll be filling these holes so that the plaster ends up flush with the board. In order to do this with accuracy, you can either use a drywall screwdriver bit, the ring of which prevents screwing in too far, or you can use a collated screw gun, which, has to be said, is a lot of fun. There are also cheaper versions which attach to your drill. The screws come on a thread which automatically feeds the gun one after the other. I went for the cheaper option though, and it goes by pretty fast. My tip of the day to those of you juggling a build with work is to leave the jobs like screwing and nailing, which neither require getting dirty nor many tools, to do in between the bigger jobs. It's very easy to pick up a drill driver and some screws and fit in an hour here and there over the week, and then get out all your saws and tools and do the messy stuff on the weekends. So that's why when attaching the plasterboard I only put in enough screws to hold it in place, and then came back when I was short on time to do the rest. And I used the same tactic when it came to doing my decking. Next we did the back wall because with no windows it seemed like the easiest. We did the top row first in order to get it tightly up to the ceiling. When it came to the bottom row, we had to cut out the holes for the plug sockets. In the electric stage, I'd let my electrician know what thickness of plasterboard I was using, so my sockets and plug boxes protrude by 12.5mm, and are therefore flush once plasterboarded. If you're going for a full skim, you may want yours to protrude a little further, but it doesn't have to be too precise. First we had to mark on the plasterboard where the holes for the sockets were to be, which can either be done with some careful measuring, or you can place the board on the wall and then use a scrap piece to give it a good whack, not too vigorous mind, and that creates the outline of the socket on the back of the plasterboard. This works really well with the metal back boxes that I have, but probably wouldn't with some plastic types. Once we had them marked out, we tried a few different methods, but settled on drilling the 4 corners through to the other side, and then scored along the 4 edges. The drilled holes stop your knife from slipping too far. Then we scored an X in the middle, flipped the sheet over, and then did the same on the other side, using the drilled holes to denote the 4 corners. We could then punch through, and then cleaned up using a surf form again. You could also use a serrated knife, which I'll show for a different cut later on. Next we started on the left wall, and because my ceiling is sloped, we figured it was quicker and easier to start with the bottom row with a level board and then cut the slope and height in one cut to the top row of plasterboard. I'm not sure if this is obvious or not, but to do so you measure and cut the width, then measure the heights on either side, transfer these to your board, and then that gives you the slope that you need to cut. Now, the bottom of the plasterboard shouldn't sit on the floor for a few reasons. Number one, plasterboard is basically compressed dust sandwiched between paper, so any spillages on the floor will quickly be soaked up, and having the gap prevents this. Number two, it allows for expansion and contraction of the floor and walls. And three, if you're going for flooring like laminate, it needs to be able to expand and therefore requires a 10mm space all around the edges. If you were to plasterboard all the way down to the floor, a 15mm wide skirting board will only cover 5mm of the laminate. So if it contracts, you'll see a gap. This is also an issue in houses because where there was carpet originally, the skirting goes all the way down to the floor, and then you have to use these floor trims to cover the gap if you update to oak or laminate flooring. So by raising the plasterboard up, the flooring can go within 10mm of the stud, and then the skirting goes on top, giving a good 15mm plus room for contraction. Thicker skirting can help too, of course. My flooring is 12mm thick and underlay is 5, so we use 2 offcuts of plasterboard to raise the bottom row up to give enough space to accommodate both, and then some extra. Next we did the front wall. We were in our stride by this point, and due to the window and door we did end up doing some vertical sheets here. For the right wall, I was on my own again. You may have noticed the vapor barrier is a different colour from the last video. I'd replaced it for a reason I can't recall now, but in my haste I'd forgotten to cut out the socket here, so on the second fix my electrician had to locate it and dig it out. No harm done, but it's worth double checking you've cut out all of yours. Maybe count them before and after you've done your vapor barrier. To make the hole for the radiator conduit, I drilled a circle of holes and then used a plasterboard saw to cut it out. For sheets next to a door, you can use the Surform from the side once attached to the wall. For the window above, I decided to create a cutout in the centre of a sheet and used a regular handsaw, which actually works really well, and you get a clean cut. I suspect that above the top corners of the doors are weak points, as I've had a couple of hairline cracks in my plaster I've had to go over again. So I reckon that it's better, if possible, to cut the plasterboard in an L shape so that the two edges meet above the centre of the door. It creates a bit of waste, but might be worth considering. For around the windows, my original plan was to use whatever timber cladding I used for the outside as window trim to kind of bring the outside in, but once I saw how striking Nick's anthracite grey windows looked against the painted reveals, I decided to go with that look instead, which meant plasterboarding around the windows. The big advantage of timber frame versus brick and block cavity is the thinness of the wall. So in the small gardens we have in the UK, timber framing allows you to maximise the internal floor space. But the drawback is you end up with much thinner window reveals. As long as you don't intend to put ornaments on your windowsill, it's fine looks-wise, but does present a couple of minor issues. The first is later on when I fitted recessed blinds. They sort of project out a bit more than I'd have ideally liked, and the second is fitting the plasterboard, as you can only get one line of screws in before scoring and folding back, which on my first attempt broke the plasterboard at an unwanted angle. I first tried using smaller pieces to use up what I had left over of the plasterboard, but that doesn't give much leverage to break the plasterboard, and I had to saw off the excess, which isn't ideal. Much better is to use a larger piece, as that does give you the leverage. But it's tricky to get your arm in behind to cut through on the other side of the paper, so I just cut through from the initial side that I'd scored from. Not the easiest, but it works. Alternatively, you could cut a strip of plasterboard the right width and just screw it down. I had some leftover sheets, so decided against using moisture-resistant plasterboard in the shower room and instead use what I had. It's not going to get heavy use and it has good air extraction, so I'm confident it'll be fine. Onto cement boarding. I snapped a pic of this handy table in Selco, which shows that while you can tile ceramic onto plasterboard in dry areas, you can't in wet areas, such as in a shower. So for wet areas or for heavier tile, you need cement board, which doesn't weaken or crumble when wet, and it's waterproof. Being composed of cement, it's pretty heavy, so along with the tile, I did wonder about subjecting my floor and foundations to that weight. The alternative is to use plastic shower wall panels, which actually look pretty good and are very lightweight, but they're also pricey. So I figured that it would be okay and went with some Hardybacker cement board. It's more or less the same thickness as the plasterboard I use, so the two meet together nicely, and comes in a 1200 by 800mm sheet, which was very handy as my shower tray is 1200mm long and the height of the wall exactly 3 boards high, so no cutting required here. For the other areas I did need to cut it to size. The proper way is to use a carbide blade, but I didn't have that, so instead I scored it with a normal utility knife a few dozen times, Then I gave it a hammer, and then I danced a little jig. There's always a way. To attach, I used the same drywall screws as before, which worked really well, but there's some debate over whether a proper wood screw would be more appropriate. If I were using heavier porcelain tiles, I'd probably think more deeply about it, but so far I've had no issues. It's not a problem if the screw heads sit on the surface, as they'll be covered by a decent layer of tile adhesive. So you can see where the tile will go by where the cement board is, and the rest of the shower room will just be painted plasterboard. Lastly, the joints are covered by an alkali-resistant mesh tape. It has one sticky side which you apply to the cement board, to which you then apply waterproof tile adhesive, which waterproofs the whole thing with no need to tank, but that's for another video. I want to say a big thanks to Steve. Plasterboarding really is a two-person job, and I would have really struggled without him. I returned the favour as Steve has been doing some renovations to his house, including some interesting soundproofing methods during plasterboarding. So I may make a video on that topic at some point. I really did think I'd get to the tape and jointing in this video, but as ever, I think of all the things that I'd want to know when taking on this project, and the video turns out longer than expected. So that's going to be the next video. In the meantime, I have a resource for you. I've made a simplified version of the span tables for floor and flat roof joists, which can be downloaded from the resources page of the website. I've added in some explanations and suggestions pertinent to garden rooms, so hopefully that will be a help to many of you. I'll see you on the next one.